Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is my Victober TBR. I am super excited about Victober. I love this event on BookTube. Plus, it happens in October, which is my birthday month. So how is that not perfect, right? So I have the challenges here in front of me and I will show you what I am going to read for Victober this year. I will include in the description box below the links to the announcement videos by the hosts. Victober is hosted by Katie from Books and Things, Kate Howe, and Lucy the Reader. Lucy's challenge is to read a Victorian novel with a female main character. And so for that, I am going with The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. There you go. The edition here that I have is just a boring green cover. So, The Legacy of Cain was written in 1888 and it is the last book that Wilkie Collins wrote before he died. It explores the theme of hereditary evil and attacks the idea that bad blood necessarily results in criminality. It's mainly narrated by the prison governor who always feared the adoption of the child born to executed murderess would end badly because of the taint of inherited evil. So I'm excited to get into that. Katie's challenge is to read a book set in the countryside and or the city. And for that, I'm going to read William Harrison Ainsworth's Old St. Paul's. This is a book that he wrote in the early Victorian time period. He wrote Old St. Paul's in 1841. According to the synopsis, and this is an Everyman's Library edition, Old St. Paul's ranks as one of the most exciting romances of old London, full of the narrative skill that makes this author such a readable historical romancer, with enough history to give the book authentic flavor. It vividly projects the days of the Great Plague of 1665, followed by the equally harrowing days of London's Great Fire, from which modern London rose like a phoenix from the ashes. Quote, "We see the old city," says William Axon introducing, "with its narrow lanes, picturesque houses, noble churches, broad waterway, suddenly brought to desolation, the grass growing in the streets, and hear the bell of the dead cart carrying its ghastly burden." But, end quote. But we hastened to add that although the background is somber, the trend of the story is romantic, and through its pages strides one of the author's strangest yet most impressive characters, Solomon Eagle, denouncing the modern Nineveh. So I'm excited. I really like William Harrison Ainsworth. He writes historical romances, so they are overly dramatic histories. And yeah, so I'm excited to read that one. Kate's challenge is to read a sensation novel. For that, I am going to count The Legacy of Cain by Wilkie Collins. Kate very kindly gave us a good description of what a sensation novel is, and that it's a novel that has a secret. And there's definitely a secret in that, because the secret is which of the two daughters that are the main characters is the adopted one, the daughter of the murderess. So yeah, the group challenge is to read a popular Victorian novel, and for that I am going to count Old St. Paul's by William Harrison Ainsworth, because at the time it was written, it was very popular. William Harrison Ainsworth was very popular at the time, and then he fell out of favor. So that's the one I'm going to count for that. The bonus challenge is to read aloud or to have read aloud to you some Victorian work, short stories, or a passage from a book. And so I am going to listen to potentially some short stories or just a passage from a book. I might listen to The Woman in White. I love that story, and so I might listen to that a bit. The group read is Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell. And I'm excited for this. I enjoy Elizabeth Gaskell. I also really enjoy Gothic stories. So I am excited to get into that one as well. And then finally, I am also going to participate in the Wuthering Heights read-along by Emily Bronte. Wuthering Heights is by Emily Bronte. The read-along is hosted by Kate Howe, Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and then one or two other hosts as well. I'll put the information for this read-along also down below. I think I'll just put a link for Kate Howe's announcement video. So if you want to participate in this read-along. I love Wuthering Heights. It is a great story. It is wonderfully atmospheric. It's very gothic. But I haven't read it for probably 20 years. So I am completely up for a reread of Wuthering Heights. So that is my TBR for Victober 2020. What do you think? I am being very modest here, hoping to be able to read all of these in the month of October. Okay, so I'm adding this little clip in at the end because there were some books that I was reading for Victober that I forgot to include in the first time I filmed, because these aren't books that fulfill the prompts. They're just additional books that fit Victober that I wanted to read. And so let's just dive straight into these. This one came from the library, so I'm able to show you. This is The Female Detective by Andrew Forrester. This is part of the British Library Crime Classics collection. Miss Gladden, the first female detective, is a determined and resourceful figure with ingenious skills of logic and deduction. Pursuing mysterious cases, she works undercover and only introduces herself as a detective when the need arises. Her personal circumstances and even her real name are never revealed. This obfuscation makes sense considering that when The Female Detective was first published in 1864, there were no official female detectives in Britain. In fact, there were no women police officers either, and would not be for another 50 years. And the novel itself was well ahead of its time. Further stories and novels featuring women detectives would not be widely published until the turn of the century. So this one, I started reading this one last year and then I had to take it back to the library. So I've got it again and really excited to dive into this one. I also have some nonfiction that I want to try to get to. I have The Rise and Fall of the Victorian Servant by Pamela Horn. This was a book published in 1975, and it is, it's exactly what it says. It is The Rise and Fall of the Victorian Servant. In Victorian England, society was divided into those who had servants and those who did not. A third category, comprised of nearly 1.5 million people by the end of the 19th century, formed the largest occupational group in the country, the servants. What were the reasons for such large-scale employment of domestic servants? How were they recruited and trained? How were they treated? What were their legal rights? What were their specific duties? In what conditions did they work? What were their problems and how did they seek to overcome them? How did they feel about the nature of their employment? What was it like to be in service? So that one just sounds really interesting. I also have Travels in West Africa by Mary Kingsley. This is part of National Geographic Adventure Classics. In 1893, defying every convention of Victorian womanhood, Mary Kingsley set off alone for West Africa to collect botanical specimens. Unaccompanied except for native guides, she plunged boldly into forbidding jungle, often the first European and almost always the first white woman ever to arrive. Undaunted by tales of ferocious cannibals, she made friends with the tribes she met and collected priceless samples of flora and fauna. Along the way, she fought off crocodiles with a paddle and hit a leopard over the head with a pot. When she fell into a trap lined with sharp sticks, she was saved by her voluminous crinolines, for she always dressed like a lady. Travels in West Africa is a book as vivid and unforgettable as the extraordinary woman herself. So I'm really excited to dive into that one. And then my last nonfiction pick is The Invention of Murder by Judith Flanders. how the Victorians reveled in death and detection and created modern crime. So this one, I'm really, really excited about this one. Pleasant it is, no doubt, to drink tea with your sweetheart, but most disagreeable to find her bubbling in the tea urn. So wrote Thomas de Quincey in 1826, and it is hard not to agree. What was pleasant, he thought, was to read about someone else's sweetheart bubbling in the urn. Over the course of the 19th century, murder, a rarity in life, became ubiquitous, transformed into novels, into broadsides and ballads, into theater and melodrama and opera, even into puppet shows and performing dog acts. Detective fiction and the new police force developed in parallel, each imitating the other. The founders of Scotland Yard gave rise to Dickens' Inspector Bucket, the first fictional police detective, who in turn influenced Sherlock Holmes and ultimately even P.D. James and Patricia Cornwell. In this meticulously researched and compellingly written exploration of a century of murder, Judith Flanders explores some of the most gripping and gruesome cases, both famous and obscure, from Greenacre, who transported his dismembered fiancée around London by omnibus, to Burke and Hare's body business in Edinburgh, from the tragedy of orphans left to die of neglect in baby farms, to Eleanor Percy, who murdered her lover's wife and child, only for the lover to sell his mustache to Madame Tussaud's to give that vital touch of authenticity to his own waxwork after her execution. The modern age is heralded by the case of Towel the Quaker, the first murderer caught by telegraph, and the perennially notorious Jack the Ripper, the savagery of his crimes setting new standards of horror. Flanders uses the stories of murder, from the brutal to the pathetic, to build up a rich and multifaceted portrait of Victorian society, filled to the brim with swindlers, forgers, poisoners, and all-round bad hats. The Invention of Murder is both a gripping tale of crime and punishment and history at its most readable. And then I have some Victorian era historical mysteries that I would also like to get to in the month of October, just because it fits in so well with Victober. I have The Fiancee's Guide to First Wives and Murder by Dianne Freeman. This is the latest in her Countess of Harley series. This is a woman, her name is Frances. She's an American who married a British person with a title. He needed her money, basically. And she's a widow and gets herself involved in murder. And I really enjoy this series. And it is set in the later Victorian time period, 1899. And I have Limelight by Emily Organ. This one is set in London in 1883. Actress Lizzie Dixie drowned in the River Thames. So how was she murdered 5 years later in Highgate Cemetery? Good question. I have The House at Baker Street by Michelle Birkby. Behind every great detective stands a great woman. And this is a Mrs. Hudson and Mary Watson investigation. When Sherlock Holmes turns down the case of persecuted Laura Shirley, Mrs. Hudson, the landlady of Baker Street, and Mary Watson, the wife of Dr. Watson, resolve to take on the investigation themselves. From the kitchen of 221B, the two women begin their inquiries and enlist the assistance of the Baker Street irregulars and the infamous Irene Adler. A trail of clues leads them to the darkest corners of Whitechapel, where the famous Ripper supposedly still stalks. They soon discover Laura Shirley is not the only woman at risk. The lives of many others are in danger too. Mistress of the Just Land by David Ashton. This is set in Victorian Edinburgh, New Year's Day, and the main character is she runs a bawdy house, and there is a murder at her house. A prominent judge is found dead. So there's that one. And then I have Murder on Millionaires Row by Erin Lindsey. This one is set during the Victorian time period, but it's in New York. In Gilded Age Manhattan, a daring housemaid searches for her missing employer and finds a hidden world of magic, ghosts, romance, and Pinkerton detectives. This one, I enjoyed the first paragraph of this one. As I tell you this story, I'll thank you to remember that I was young and in love. That's not an excuse, but if you're looking to understand what happened on that day in January 1886, what really happened, mind you, not the version you read in Harper's Weekly or the New York Tribune, then you ought to have the whole picture. So yes, I was 19 years old, and yes, I had a blinding crush on my employer, one Mr. Thomas Wiltshire of 726 Fifth Avenue. And those facts together led me to make certain choices in those early hours, choices that might charitably be called naive. Some of the actions I took I'm not particularly proud of, but I wouldn't take a one of them back either, which is saying a lot considering how near they came to getting me killed. I thought that was good. And then finally, A Tale of Two Murders by Heather Redmond, a Dickens of a crime. On the eve of the Victorian era, London has a new sleuth. In the winter of 1835, young Charles Dickens is a journalist on the rise at the Evening Chronicle. Invited to dinner at the estate of a newspaper's co-editor, Charles is smitten with his boss's daughter, vivacious 19-year-old Kate Hogarth. They are having the best of times when a scream shatters the pleasant evening. Charles, Kate, and her father rush to the neighbor's home where Miss Christiana Lugeson lies unconscious on the floor. By morning, the young woman will be dead. So there you have it. Those are some additional books that I want to read to celebrate all things Victorian during Victober. Are you participating in Victober? I would love to know what you're planning to read, and I will see you for another video soon. Bye.